Hey guys, tonight we are embarking on something special. A full 2-hour journey through the brutal winters of medieval piracy and the food that kept these seafaring raiders alive. Yeah, you heard that right. 2 hours. Most of you will not make it past hour 1, and honestly, that is the point. Close your eyes and imagine this. The year is 1342. You stand on the wooden deck of a pirate vessel, somewhere off the coast of northern Europe. The wind cuts through your woolen layers like a knife made of ice itself. Your fingers have gone numb hours ago. The sea around you churns with gray waves, topped with white foam. Above you, the sky hangs heavy and dark, threatening snow that will make everything even more miserable than it already is. Your stomach growls. It has been growling for days now. The last hot meal you remember feels like a distant dream, something from another lifetime in Orly. The resulting stew was ladled into wooden bowls or onto pieces of hardtack that served as edible plates. Every crew member got an equal portion, unless the captain or officers claimed special privileges, and the cook was responsible for ensuring fairness in distribution. Evening meals were similar to midday meals, though sometimes smaller portions were served as supplies ran low during long voyages. After the evening meal, the fire would be allowed to die down to coals, which were carefully preserved under ashes to make the next morning's fire starting easier. A completely dead fire meant hours of work with flint and steel to restart it, so maintaining those precious coals overnight was a priority. Special cooking techniques developed in the harsh winter environment. Frying was possible when fat was available, and fried foods provided variety in texture and flavor that was otherwise missing. So before you get comfortable, and I mean really comfortable because we are in for the long haul, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. I see you. 3 in the morning squad. For those using this for sleep, I have designed the pacing to gradually slow over our 2 hours together. Hour 1 will keep you engaged with stories of survival, hardship, and the surprising ingenuity of medieval pirates. And by hour 2, well, sweet dreams. Now, dim those lights. Set your sleep timer if you are wise. Maybe turn on that fan for white noise. And let us ease into tonight's marathon journey together. You are about to discover what medieval pirates really ate to survive brutal winters. Not the romantic image of pirates from movies. Not the swashbuckling adventurers with unlimited supplies. The cook might fry salt pork until it was crispy, then use the rendered fat to fry pieces of hardtack, or even to fry whole fish if fishing had been successful. Roasting over the fire was difficult on a moving ship, but sometimes accomplished using improvised spits or wires stretched across the firebox. Baking was nearly impossible in the ship's galley because there was no oven. However, some cooks developed techniques for baking directly on hot stones or metal surfaces placed in the fire. These methods could produce something like flatbreads or simple cakes if flour and water were available. The results were not sophisticated, but provided welcome variety from the endless boiled and fried foods. The cook's hands bore the scars of constant burns from working over an open fire on a moving ship. The rocking motion meant that hot pots could tip or spill without warning. Hot fat could splash. Coals could roll out of the firebox. But the real men and women who faced freezing temperatures, dwindling food stores, and the very real possibility of starvation at sea. This is a story of survival. This is a story of hunger. This is a story of human determination in the face of nature's cruelest season. Medieval piracy looked nothing like the golden age of piracy you might imagine from the 1700s. Medieval pirates operated in a world without advanced navigation, without the global trade routes that would come centuries later, and without the preserved foods that later generations would take for granted. These were raiders who worked the cold northern waters of Europe, the Baltic Sea, the North Sea, and the treacherous coastlines, where winter meant death for the unprepared. Winter at sea in medieval times was not just uncomfortable, it was genuinely life-threatening. Working in winter with numb hands made these dangers worse because the cook might not immediately feel a burn until serious damage had occurred. Experienced ship's cooks developed thick calluses and an almost supernatural ability to work around the fire safely, despite constant motion and distraction. The relationship between the cook and the crew was delicate. The cook controlled food distribution, which gave significant power, but also made the cook a target for complaints when rations were small, or when food was particularly unappetizing. A good cook, who could make even terrible ingredients somewhat palatable, was valued and protected by the crew. A bad cook, who served spoiled food, or who was suspected of taking extra portions for himself, might face violence from hungry, desperate pirates. You smell smoke now. Wood smoke mixed with the scent of boiling salt pork and the underlying smell of unwashed men in close quarters. The fire flickers in your imagination. Ships in the 1300s and 1400s were smaller, less seaworthy, and far more vulnerable to winter storms than the vessels that came later. Most pirates tried to avoid sailing during the worst winter months, but circumstances did not always allow for choice. Sometimes you were caught out in a late autumn raid when winter arrived early. Sometimes you were fleeing from authorities and could not make port. Sometimes your crew was desperate enough that winter raiding seemed like the only option for survival. The food situation for these medieval pirates during winter was complicated by several factors that modern people rarely consider. First, there were no refrigeration methods whatsoever. Second, food preservation techniques were primitive by later standards. Third, ships had limited storage space. Fourth, many foods that could survive at room temperature in summer would freeze solid in winter, creating different problems. Orange and yellow light dancing in the darkness. The pot bubbles steadily. The ship rocks. The cold wind tries to invade the galley, but the cook blocks it with his body, hunched over the fire, stirring the eternal stew. Your eyelids are very heavy. The warmth from the imaginary fire soaks into you. Your muscles release their last tension. Each breath carries you deeper into the comfortable darkness. The cook will tend the fire while you sleep. The stew will be ready when you wake. If you wake, you are so comfortable now, so ready to let go. The galley fire burns on. You drift away on its smoke. Rationing systems and the desperate mathematics of fairness among hungry crews deserve careful attention, because this was where pirate survival became a test of leadership, discipline, and community cohesion. Fifth, the very act of eating could become difficult when your water supply froze and your fingers were too numb to grip a spoon. You need to understand something fundamental about medieval maritime life. Everything was harder. Everything took longer. Everything was more dangerous. The simple act of feeding yourself became a daily challenge that required planning, rationing, and a tolerance for food that would make most modern people physically ill. Pirates, already operating outside the law and outside the normal supply chains of legitimate merchants, faced even greater challenges than regular sailors. The men and women who turned to piracy in medieval times did so for various reasons. Some were dispossessed soldiers, looking for income after wars ended. Some were fishermen who found more profit in raiding than in honest work. Some were escaped serfs, seeking freedom on the waves. Some were members of organized pirate communities that controlled certain harbors and coast regions. When food supplies ran low during brutal winters, the decisions about how to distribute limited resources could mean the difference between a crew that survived together and a crew that turned on itself in violence and chaos. The philosophy and practice of rationing reveal as much about pirate culture as any battle or raid. The basic principle of rationing was deceptively simple. Count your food supplies, estimate how long until you could obtain more food, and divide the supplies evenly across that time period. In practice, this calculation was filled with uncertainties and complications. How accurately could you inventory supplies stored in multiple barrels, scattered around the ship? How long would the voyage actually take when weather was unpredictable? How much food was truly edible versus spoiled? How much should be held in reserve for true emergencies? Every assumption in the rationing calculation could be wrong, and being wrong could mean death. What united them all was a willingness to live a hard life in exchange for the possibility of wealth and freedom. And part of that hard life was the constant challenge of finding enough food to survive. Tonight, you will learn about the foods that sustained these medieval pirates. You will discover preservation techniques that seem almost magical in their effectiveness. You will hear about meals that were both revolting and life-saving. You will understand why certain foods became staples of maritime life for centuries. And as the hours pass, as your eyelids grow heavy, you will drift away to the rhythm of waves and the steady cadence of survival stories from a distant, brutal age. Let us begin. You need to understand who these medieval pirates actually were before you can appreciate their struggle with winter food supplies. The quartermaster, a position that existed on many pirate ships in the medieval period and would become more formalized in later centuries, often handled rationing decisions. The quartermaster represented the crew's interests and managed common supplies. When the quartermaster announced reduced rations because supplies were running low, this carried more authority than if the captain made the same announcement. The crew trusted that the quartermaster was making decisions in their collective interest rather than favoring officers or hiding food for personal use. Daily rations were distributed at specific times using standardized measures. Each crew member received a certain number of hardtack biscuits, a certain portion of salt meat or fish, a certain amount of dried peas if available, and a certain measure of beer or water. The portions were defined not by weight, but by count and volume measures that everyone understood. You received 4 biscuits, not half a pound of biscuit. The term pirate in the medieval period covered a wide range of seafaring raiders operating across different regions with different tactics and different levels of organization. These were not the Caribbean pirates of popular imagination. These were the maritime raiders of medieval Europe, operating primarily in the cold northern waters where winter was a constant threat. The Vikings were perhaps the earliest and most famous medieval pirates, though they raided during what historians call the early medieval period, roughly from the late 700s through the 1000s. By the later medieval period, the 13th through 15th centuries, Viking culture had transformed significantly. However, their descendants and the cultures influenced by them continued maritime raiding traditions. Scandinavian pirates still operated in the Baltic Sea and North Sea throughout the medieval period, using tactics and knowledge passed down through generations. You received 1 cup of dried peas, not 200 grams. This system was simple enough that everyone could verify they were receiving their fair share. When supplies ran critically low, rations were reduced in stages. The first reduction might be from 4 biscuits per day to 3. The next reduction would go to 2 biscuits. If the situation became desperate, rations might drop to 1 biscuit per day, plus a small portion of whatever else was available. At the same time, beer rations might be cut from a full pint to half a pint to a quarter pint. Every reduction was announced and explained to the crew, often in communal meetings where everyone could understand the situation and express concerns. Special provisions were sometimes made for crew members who were sick, injured, or performing particularly demanding work. A pirate recovering from wounds needed more food to heal. The Hanseatic League, while officially a trading alliance, also bred pirates and pirate hunters in equal measure. Merchants who lost legitimate trade opportunities sometimes turned to piracy. Cities that were excluded from the League's benefits sometimes sponsored pirates to raid Hanseatic shipping. The Baltic Sea became a complex web of legitimate trade, semi-legitimate raiding, and outright piracy, all operating in waters that froze solid during the harshest winters. English pirates operated throughout the medieval period, raiding French ships during the 100 Years' War and attacking anyone else when officially sanctioned warfare was not available. The English Channel, despite being one of the busiest waterways in medieval Europe, was also one of the most dangerous for legitimate shipping. Winter made these raids less frequent, but also more desperate, as pirates needed supplies to survive until spring. A pirate working the pumps continuously to keep the ship from sinking needed extra calories to sustain that exhausting labor. These special allocations had to be balanced against the resentment they might cause among other crew members who were also hungry. The decisions were often made collectively or with significant input from the crew to maintain legitimacy and prevent accusations of favoritism. Officers traditionally received larger or better quality rations than common crew members on legitimate merchant and military vessels. Medieval pirate ships varied in how they handled officer privileges. Some pirate crews maintained traditional hierarchies, with officers eating better food in separate quarters. Other crews operated with more egalitarian principles, where everyone received identical rations, regardless of rank. French pirates, particularly those operating from Normandy and Brittany, were equally active. The constant wars between England and France meant that piracy often blurred into privateering, which was technically legal raiding with government approval. But when wars ended and letters of marque were revoked, many privateers simply continued raiding without authorization. Winter did not stop these men. It merely changed their tactics. The Barbary pirates operated in warmer Mediterranean waters, but even they faced winter challenges. The Mediterranean winter, while milder than northern European winters, still brought storms, cold temperatures, and reduced shipping traffic. Barbary pirates sometimes sailed as far north as the British Isles, where they would have encountered truly brutal winter conditions, unlike anything they experienced in North Africa. Baltic pirates, known as the Victual Brothers, or Vitalian Bruder, were a particularly interesting case. During winter food crises, even ships with normally hierarchical structures often moved toward equal rationing, because maintaining officer privileges when crew members were starving was an excellent way to trigger mutiny. Shared meals created both problems and opportunities for crew cohesion. When food was distributed and everyone ate together, there was transparency about portions and quality. Everyone could see that the portions were equal and that no one was secretly eating more than their share. However, communal eating also meant that every meal was a reminder of scarcity, a public display of how little food remained and how hungry everyone continued to be, despite eating their full rations. Punishment for stealing food was severe on most pirate ships. A crew member caught taking more than their fair share faced flogging, being put ashore at the next landing, or in extreme cases, execution. This was an organized pirate confederation that initially operated with some level of legitimacy, supplying besieged Stockholm during a war. After the war ended, they continued operating as pirates, controlling entire islands and effectively running their own small maritime empire. Their base in Gotland meant they were intimately familiar with Baltic winters, which could be extraordinarily harsh. Scottish and Irish pirates raided throughout the medieval period, operating in waters that were consistently cold even in summer. For them, winter was simply an extension of the generally miserable maritime conditions they already endured year-round. Their small maneuverable vessels were well suited to coastal raiding, but offered minimal protection from the elements. What all these different pirate groups shared was a fundamental challenge. Stealing from communal food stores during a winter crisis was seen as one of the worst possible offenses because it threatened everyone's survival. The harsh punishments served as deterrents, but also as a way for the crew to collectively express their fury at anyone who would betray the group during such difficult times. The psychological burden of rationing fell heavily on whoever had to make the calculations and announcements. Telling hungry people that their already small portions were being reduced further was not pleasant work. The quartermaster or captain had to project confidence that the reduced rations would be sufficient, that resupply would come before starvation, that the plan would work. If the crew lost faith in leadership's ability to manage food supplies, the authority structure could collapse completely. Some pirate crews dealt with rationing by adopting gambling or lottery systems for certain food privileges. How do you feed yourself and your crew when you operate outside legitimate supply chains, when you cannot reliably make port, when the seas around you are freezing, and when the food you manage to steal or store is running dangerously low? How do you survive winter on a small wooden ship with no heat, limited storage, and the very real possibility that your next raid will fail and leave you with nothing? These medieval pirates developed a food culture born of necessity. They adopted preservation techniques from various maritime traditions. They stole food whenever possible, but also learned what foods were worth stealing and what foods would simply spoil before they could be consumed. They traded information about which ports would tolerate pirates in winter, which merchants could be trusted to sell to outlaws, and which coastal villages could be raided for supplies without triggering massive retaliation. For example, if the ship had only a small amount of fresh food from a recent raid or fishing expedition, this food might be distributed by drawing lots rather than trying to divide it into equal tiny portions. Everyone had an equal chance to win the fresh food, which was fair in a different way than perfectly equal distribution. These systems introduced elements of chance and excitement that helped break the monotony of survival rationing. Alcohol rationing followed different rules than food rationing. While food was distributed with the goal of preventing starvation, alcohol was distributed with the goal of maintaining morale without allowing drunkenness. Even when food rations were severely reduced, alcohol rations were sometimes maintained or even increased slightly because drunk pirates were easier to manage than hungry, sober pirates contemplating mutiny. The social structure of pirate crews in medieval times also affected how they managed food. Unlike later pirate democracies of the Golden Age, medieval pirate crews often followed more hierarchical structures, similar to legitimate ships. The captain and officers typically ate better than common crew members, though the disparity was less extreme than on merchant or military vessels. Food allocation could cause serious conflicts within crews, especially during lean winter months, when every extra ration meant the difference between strength and weakness. You begin to feel the weight of history settling over you. The challenges these medieval pirates faced were immense. Every decision about food had consequences. Every choice about rationing affected crew morale. Every raid carried the risk of death from combat or storms. And through it all, winter loomed as a constant threat, a season that could kill through cold and starvation as easily as any enemy blade. Your breathing slows. Of course, this strategy had limits, and completely drunk crews were unable to function. So alcohol rationing required constant adjustment based on circumstances. The end of rationing, when the ship finally obtained new supplies, was always a celebrated moment. The first full meal after weeks of reduced rations was remembered by survivors as one of the most satisfying eating experiences of their lives. However, leaders had to prevent crew members from gorging themselves too quickly. after extended rationing, because eating large quantities after prolonged hunger could cause serious digestive problems. The transition from rationing back to normal eating had to be managed carefully. You feel the hunger now, the constant gnawing hunger that never quite goes away even after eating your rations. The mental calculation of how many biscuits remain. The dream of full meals that seems impossibly distant. But you also feel the mathematics of fairness. The story continues to unfold. The medieval world feels very far away, and sleep feels closer than you expected. Now you enter the world of food preservation in medieval times, and this is where pirate survival truly began. Without effective preservation methods, winter maritime life would have been impossible. Food spoilage was not just an inconvenience for medieval pirates, it was a death sentence. Understanding how medieval pirates preserved food helps you appreciate the incredible challenge they faced and the ingenuity they applied to survival. Salting was the primary preservation method known to medieval Europe, and pirates relied on it constantly. Salt worked by drawing moisture out of food through osmosis, creating an environment where bacteria could not thrive. Medieval pirates salted fish, meat, vegetables, and even some fruits when they could obtain enough salt and enough food to preserve. The knowledge that everyone suffers equally. The comfort of shared hardship. Your stomach is empty, but your conscience is clear. Your breathing continues its slow, steady rhythm. You have surrendered to the rationing. You have accepted the mathematics of survival. The numbers blur. The hunger fades. Sleep offers better sustenance than any ration could provide. You drift toward that sleep now. Grateful, peaceful, almost gone. Trading networks and restocking in winter harbors provided lifelines for medieval pirates who could not survive on raiding alone. This aspect of pirate life is often overlooked in dramatic retellings that focus on combat and plunder. But the reality was that successful pirates needed to engage with legitimate and semi-legitimate trade networks to obtain supplies that they could not effectively steal or produce themselves. Winter made these trading relationships even more critical because opportunities for raiding decreased while the need for provisions increased. The process was simple in theory, but required significant quantities of salt, which was expensive and sometimes hard to obtain for outlaws operating outside normal trade channels. Drying food was another essential technique. Fish could be dried in cold air, creating a product that would last months if kept dry. Meat could also be dried, though the process was more difficult and were often tougher and less palatable than salted meat. Pirates operating in northern waters had an advantage during winter because the cold, dry air was perfect for preservation. They would hang fish and meat from the rigging during cold days, letting the wind and low temperatures do the work of desiccation. Smoking food combined preservation with flavor enhancement. Pirates who controlled coastal bases sometimes had access to smokehouses where they could preserve large quantities of meat and fish. Certain ports throughout northern Europe developed reputations as places that would trade with pirates, despite the legal and ethical problems this created. These ports were usually small coastal towns, far from centers of royal authority, places where local authorities either did not care about the legal status of customers or actively benefited from pirate trade. A pirate crew arriving in such a port with stolen goods could exchange plunder for food, drink, ship's supplies, other necessities, without fear of